welcome to I Love This Thing So Fricking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by John, a writer and actor. Welcome to the show, John.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. So, here's how this works. John will have 3 minutes to talk about something that he loves. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything he wants. Our only requirement is that he loves it wholeheartedly and wants to tell us why. Are you ready, John?
I hope so.
All right, got my timer here. Now, what do you love so freaking much?
What I love so freaking much is Alice in Wonderland, the stories by Lewis Carroll. There are, of course, 2 books. There's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and then there's the second book, the full title, which is Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Because that's a mouthful, most people just say Through the Looking Glass. I have really no idea why I love these books so much. I've been trying to figure that out for years. The way it started was when I was a little kid. Of course, I saw the Disney film, as a lot of other people did. And I really liked the Disney film, but I never was really super obsessed with it. It was just one of those things I liked. The weird thing is, over time, that instead of that being something like when you're in childhood, certain things will decline in interest. That became something where over time I began to like it more and more. And part of that was when I was in middle school, I got a chance to read the original books. And then after I read the original books, I started getting curious about other versions of the story. And so I looked at various films and TV versions and other books based on Alice in Wonderland and so on and so forth. And I just kind of fell in love and I couldn't stop. I just wanted more and more and more and more. And it went all the way into high school, it went all the way into college, and all the way into now. I'm still always kind of looking for new things. It's hard for me to say how much at this point I've indulged, how much I've read and how much I've watched. There was one point where I had a hard drive full of stuff and it had 1,000 different files on it. Unfortunately, that hard drive later crashed and I lost a lot of that, but I've also managed to regain a lot of it as well. So yeah, I've seen and read and just experienced a lot. And I've never really understood what the obsession with the story is, why so many people in general like the story. It's used so often in references and stuff. It's one of the most quoted books in the English language. It's right up there with Shakespeare and the Bible. And I've never really figured out why I'm obsessed with it. I used to say it's because there's something in it that kind of you can relate to despite how crazy it is. And I think maybe that's true still. I mean, who doesn't feel like the dormouse when they wake up on a Monday morning and just want to go back to sleep? But it's very difficult to explain. I think part of it is that it is a story that's kind of become classic idea. You have a character who is more or less normal ending up in a strange, surreal environment. And we like to see how they get through that. We like to see what creative and colorful things can come of that. And we like to see how dark or how light it can go. And the book is wonderful at balancing the two. There's a lot of funny, weird stuff in Wonderland, but there's also a lot of stuff that's kind of scary. And it's interesting to see how our character gets through that as she acts almost like a guide through this dreamland that we're going through. I think that's all.
All right. Well, thank you for telling us about Alice in Wonderland today.
No problem.
I'm really fascinated by how you answer this question about why you like Alice in Wonderland so much with all these questions of your own. It sounds like you're an explorer in the world of Alice in Wonderland almost.
That's one way of looking at it. I guess in a way I am. I've just seen so much and I'm always looking for more. And so it's just interesting to me to see how the different characters and such are interpreted throughout different versions, how different actors or different writers imagine them working.
Talk a little more about that, about the different adaptations of the story, and do any versions stand out to you as favorites?
Oh yeah, there's several favorites. In terms of movies, there's of course the Disney film. That's a classic, and I think in many ways that's the best one. Not necessarily my absolute favorite, that's a little harder to tell, but I think it's the best one because it knows how to really make this story more cinematic while still sticking true to the source. It still changes things, but the changes are a lot more minor than people will have you think. The only problem I've ever had with the Disney version is there's so many characters and things left out of it. And even though they're in tons and tons of other versions, because it's Disney, no one else knows about them. Then there's a version that's become kind of a cult classic. It's in the public domain. It was made in 1972 in the UK, and it stars a lot of major like British actors of the time, some of whom are still really known today. Michael Crawford, of all people, is the White Rabbit. There's Peter Sellers as the March Hare, and so on and so forth. And I've always really liked that one. I'm not entirely sure why. It's got kind of a theatrical quality to it in the way it's done. And I think maybe that's why, because I love theater so much. Those are probably my two favorite film versions. There's another film that's not really an Alice movie, but it's a movie about Alice. It's called Dream Child.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is about Alice Liddell, or Alice Hargreaves, the girl who inspired Lewis Carroll to write the stories. And that one's a really, really fascinating film that I think deserves a lot more attention. Also has a really great cast and everything. Beyond that, there's a lot of there's just so many. It's hard to keep track of them all. There's some TV shows, like there's one that's recently gotten onto Disney Plus called Adventures in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
I highly recommend that one. There's some stage versions. There's a musical simply called Wonderland. There's a ballet version made by the Royal Ballet in England that's since gone on to other companies around the world. It's a really, really great interpretation as well. And then there's some things like the Tim Burton movies, which are kind of controversial. I still like them, even though I have some issues with them. So there's a lot of different versions I like.
Can you talk a little more about your love of theater? And we introduced you as a writer and actor before. Is there any ways that your love of theater intersect with your love of Alice in Wonderland?
Oh, yes. I've actually written my own stage version of Alice in Wonderland, and I directed it.
All right.
It was in, I think, I can't remember what year it was now. It was either 2015 or 2016, but it was for a local company, a local kids company. And I just had this feeling that before I got out of college, for some reason, I don't know why I had this mad desire, but I had this desire that before I got out of college to direct my own version of Alice in Wonderland. And so I wrote it, and I worked with the local theater company, and I got some friends together as actors and stuff, and we did our own version of Alice. And I'm very proud of how it turned out for the most part. I think my only major regret in the end of the day is that this company usually records their performances. They're sort of guerrilla recordings. They're not super professional, but they're there in case people want to buy them because they're a nonprofit organization, so that helps them get a little bit more money in their budget. The problem was something went wrong in the recording, and so sadly that show does not exist in video form. I know it was terrible because the first act came out fine, but then the second act, something went wrong and they couldn't retrieve it. So the show sadly is not available for anyone else to see. It just existed for that very short time, but I'm very proud of what happened. I've also been in two versions of Alice in Wonderland. Both times I played the Mad Hatter. The first was with the same company. They did a show called The Doctor in Wonderland, which was sort of a parody / crossover with Doctor Who and Alice in Wonderland. And there the Mad Hatter was one of the villains. And I got to play the Hatter. And that was a really special one because that was the debut of that show. And now it's been performed in a couple of other places since in the few years that have passed. So I was the very first person to play the Hatter in that script. The other one was a company. They only lasted a short while here, sadly. They had to close because of various things. They did a production of, very simply, Alice in Wonderland. And once again, I auditioned. Once again, I got to play the Mad Hatter, this time a more traditional sort of version of the character. The fun part of that, or the most fun part of that, was my March Hare was actually one of my best friends. So that was a lot of fun.
It does sound like a lot of fun. I find it really fascinating that your love of Alice in Wonderland is not just a love that has you being entertained by all the various adaptations of this story, but you're also out there creating your own adaptations and helping other people create their adaptations of Alice in Wonderland, expanding the universe even further.
It's always fun to do that. I like writing things. When I have a passion for something like that, I don't just like to sit back and watch. I like to get into it, and I like to find my own ways of interpreting it. And things like theater allow me to do that in a lot of fun ways.
Is there anything that you don't like about Alice in Wonderland? And if so, how do you handle that?
Well, I guess if there's one thing I don't like about it, but even this is kind of a loose thing because it's hard to say there's anything I don't like in it. It's that the story is very, very loose. The story as it was originally published really doesn't have a point. And the fact it doesn't have a point is kind of the point. That was actually part of what made it popular when its heyday was back then. Most children's stories and even adult stories had some kind of moral to them. they were teaching some kind of lesson or they had some kind of, ultimate purpose. Alice was basically just complete and total insanity. And people kind of ate that up because it was something that had never been done before. The problem is, in years since, it's been found that, especially when you're trying to adapt it, it's really hard to keep that and keep it going, because the absurdity of Wonderland is such a huge part of it, but it can also kind of put people off because they don't really know what's going on and they don't really know how to follow it. And so people will try to interpret it in ways that will give it some kind of moral, or will give it more of a reason for things to happen in the plot, or a little bit of both. And to be fair, I can kind of understand why that is, because when I was doing my adaptation, I found it was so hard to stick to that absurdity. And so I ended up giving it a point, which is so hard to do with Wonderland, but also feels almost necessary. It's just a very hard story to adapt in its purest form.
Can I ask, what was the point that you gave it?
I kind of stuck to, well, the thing was, when I was writing it, I used inspiration from a lot of different versions I've seen that I really loved, as you would if you saw so many as I have. A very common theme throughout Alice in Wonderland is the theme of growing up. And so my story, my script, I kind of gave this idea that Alice would be a little older, she would be a teenager, and this was going to be sort of a coming of age story. At the start of the story, Alice is very, very childish and very naive and kind of a brat, to be honest. By the end of the story, she's learned that she has to grow up and she has to let go of certain things. And the story kind of takes in a way that's kind of bittersweet, because on the one hand, growing up is necessary. We need to learn to let go of things. We need to learn to change things. But on the other hand, it's very sad to leave things behind and put them away.
It is. It seems to me really magical that this is a story that anyone can come to and get a different point out of it as they make the story their own.
I think that's one of the reasons it's endured so long, is because since that is kind of the one upside to the fact it has no point, is you can kind of project yourself onto it and find all kinds of things gleam from it. And it also means that when you're interpreting it, you can go in all kinds of different directions. There's sci-fi versions, there's horror versions, there's versions that are really meant for little kids, there's versions that are meant for the whole family, there's versions that are straight versions of the book, there's versions that are sequels, prequels. You can go in all kinds of different directions and find all kinds of different meanings. And as long as you keep something of what was in that story, it works.
John, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
No problem. Thank you again.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about Alice in Wonderland or our guest, John, you can find his social media information in the episode description. And don't forget to use the hashtag #LoveThisThingCast to tell us about the things you love. I Love This Thing So Fricking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed and edited by Sophie A. Katz. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU the Window at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.